Hello students, today I will be covering the topic social work literature in India. The broad unit objective is to give an overview of Indian social work literature. Social work, even though it came much later comparing to the UK or the US, but a lot of literature has been developed in the country. So we will examine in today's unit the different writings that have emerged in India, what are the gaps that is there in the Indian literature regarding social work, and what are the areas in which the social work literature is focused, and also we will also highlight what are the areas which need improvement in the Indian social work literature. This particular unit will also highlight the major contribution of the Indian authors and the institutions of social work regarding the Indian social work literature. Before we proceed, I will explain to you what literature is. Conceptually, literature is a collective body of literacy production embracing the entire result of knowledge and fancy preserved in writings, including the whole body of literacy production or writing upon a given subject, reference to a particular science or branch of knowledge or of a given count period. So if you look at it, the highlighted point that when we minutely try to break down the definition, so what comes is that literature is a collective body of work. So basically these are the written production, these are the written words. These written words and production is based on certain knowledge, or even it can be sometimes imaginative narratives that had come from human creativity. Also, when we talk about literature, literature is usually specific to a subject area. It can be for social work literature, it can be a historical literature, it can be a medical literature. So basically when we try to understand the term literature, that usually deals with a specific subject matter. Also, when we try to break down the definition of what literature means, usually literature is specific to a specific time period, it is specific to a culture, because usually literature reflects the values, beliefs and experience of that particular history, geography, and also it tries to capture the cultural context of that area. When we come to the introduction of social work literature encompasses books, journals, reports, manuals as well as case studies. This volume of literature is either created by scholars, practitioners, educationists and researchers in the field of social work. The kind of literature that is coming from social work usually is based on the methods of social work as well as the values and philosophy of social work in the Indian context. In terms of social work literature, Harlecker 1968, a renowned social work educationist, she has introduced the term social work literature for the first time. She has broadly categorized social work literature into three domains. The first is knowledge from social sciences, second is knowledge from fields and programs of social work, and third is knowledge related to social work practice. I will break this down one by one, what we understand by knowledge from social sciences. Basically these are writings, these are literatures which we borrow from disciplines like sociology, psychology, anthropology, where it builds, gives the theoretical underpinning on the context of what a society is. It also sometimes gives you a broader outlook on human growth, how human behavior works and how social problems emerge. So basically these are the volume of literature which is borrowed from other discipline of social sciences. The second part, which is the knowledge of fields and programs of social work. So basically these are those literature which is coming from the field, which is the field of practice. Like in case of social work, we have medical social work, we have family and child social work, we have community social work, we have social work related to the disabled communities. So basically those literature which is coming from the practice, which are coming from the operational activities while delivering social welfare services. This is the second volume of literature that we see in India in terms of your knowledge of fields and programs of social work. The third knowledge which is specific to the social work literature is the knowledge which is related to the philosophy, methods and processes. So basically this literature comes from casework method, group work, community organizations, or as a matter of fact the other methods such as social action. So basically all the literature which has come up from directly practicing of the social work methods is what comes in the third domain as per Hal Laker in 1968. If we broadly see the development of social work literature, we can divide the stages of social work literature into 5 categories. The first one is initiation phase, the second one is the experimentation phase, the third one is the expansion phase, the fourth one is the stagnation phase, and the fourth is the explosion phase. I will deal with these various stages one by one. So the first stage, which is the initiation, which is roughly between 1936 to 46, basically these are the literature which has come up with the establishment of schools of social work like Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Delhi School of Social Work. So basically these are the literature which has come to India right after the schools of social work were established in the country. So what we see during this era is that the literature has a very strong influence from the American literature, because all the teachers, scholars who were writing those literature during this era were basically trained from United States and UK. So that's why there is a lot of influence in the writing in terms of social work literature in India during the initiation phase. Slowly it was realized that till 1946, around 46-47, that India should have its own indigenous practices, because what we see is that in the most of the literature that was being taught in the schools of social work was mostly from the Western context. So experimentation has begun with the growth of schools of social work in Delhi, Kasi and Gujarat. So during this era, because social work was mostly in our country working hand in hand with the development paradigm of the country. So the country was moving towards its developmental, bringing development in the country. So that is why what we see is that most of the literature that comes during this era of 1947 and 56 is usually focusing on the developmental context, whether it is in terms of health, whether it is in terms of education, or whether it is in terms of rural development, whatever development paradigm that the country was evolving during that time, such kind of literature was emerging in the country during the experimentation phase. In the third stage, what we see is that since the 1957, more and more institutions were coming up in the country, and also as UGC also started encouraging that the country should also start building indigenous writings. So many scholars, many academicians were writing based on the fieldwork experiences, based on how they adapted the social work theories from the Western context in the Indian context. So basically all the literature that is within this third phase of expansion of the literature in Indian was mostly based on the writings which was mostly emerging as an experimentation of the scholars in that era. Then after that, there was a stagnation phase in the literature. There was no new development, no new work that was emerging, even though there were journals like Indian Journal of Social Work, which was trying to capture literature from the work of scholars, from the work of academicians. However, there was no new dimension that was coming in the field of social work literature during the stagnation phase. Right after that, in the explosion phase, the 1987 till at present context, many institutions, schools of social work have started expanding in the country. So, that also includes private institutions. So, basically all these institutions were producing vast volume of literature. All faculty members, research scholars, they were working in different domains, and what we see in this era is that there is massive explosion of literature in the Indian context. In order to draw our narratives in terms of how the indigenous knowledge, indigenous literature has emerged in the country, as I stated earlier, that the indigenous, the social work practice, social work literature in India was mostly borrowed from the American social work context. So, that is why what we see is that till the 1980s, we do not see so much of indigenous literature being created. However, there is a rise in the field based learning in the country, and since there was a rise of field based learning that was documented all over the country, so there was a demand of local specific literature. So, that was what we see, that slowly the literature were also moving towards documenting indigenous practices, because there was a demand from the field. If we go to some of the prominent authors that have contributed in the Indian context, we can point out on these good renowned book that was written by Grace Matthew on social casework. Authors like G.R. Banerjee has written a lot on the medical settings in social work. Professor M.S. Gore has written widely on urbanization and family change that was seen in the country. Professor K.D. Gangadre has widely documented on the literature and the work that was done in the country in terms of community development. Also, some of the prominent Indian scholars who have contributed widely in terms of social work literature, some of the notable ones are Pathak, Desai, Mehta and Kulkarni. Let's further breaking down on the evolution of social work literature. We can break down into three stages. One is a stage from 1940s to 60s. What we see during this era is that the writings from J.M. Kumarappan, Titmu's writing, Masaraf's writing, so such kind of literature work has been developed between 40s and 60s. So, what you see is that during this era there will be literature based on social development, social policy, community development, which you can refer. After that, in 1977-86, we have lot of publication which is coming. If we have to name a few, the publications are mostly from in terms of articles, journals. So, Indian Journal of Social Work was producing rampantly from the 1977 onwards. The Nirmalata Niketan School of Social Work also has a journal of its own, which is known as Perspective. So, various journals which are published in India came up in 1977 to 86. From 1987 to 1996 onwards, since there was a stagnation in the second phase, because there were no such big contribution besides the articles in the journals, what we see is that in the third phase 87 to 96, there was a revival of publication in terms of book, and some of the notable work that we see is that during this India, the Encyclopedia of Social Work was also published during this era. Some of the major bibliographic initiatives which I can mention are some of the work written by Professor Desai. There is a compilation of work from 1936 to 1996. So, this particular compilation is on 10 categories. So, he has compiled a huge work of Indian literature during the era, and this you can see it literature from 1936 to 1996 onwards. The second bibliographic initiative, which is quite notable, is the work of the ASSWI and Jacob. Basically, they have reviewed books written by Indian authors and has published. So, basically during a lot of initiative has been done. So, there has been categorization of academic work as per the discipline by ASWI and Jacob, which we can use as a major bibliographic initiative by scholars in the social work domain. Moving forward, some of the compilation of social work literature in India. The first compilation will be in terms of the surveys, the large scale surveys that was taken up, the initiatives which was done in terms of the developmental work. There is a lot of literature on that when we see the kind of literature that is available in India till now. You can also see there are efforts which are undertaken by authors, academicians like G.R. Banerjee, particularly for friends who are working in the medical social work field, work of M.S. Gore, mostly on urbanization and community development. Also, if we see the scholarly work mostly focus on the social problems and the practical teaching experiences. The third landmark compilation that we see in India is in terms of the Indian Journal of Social Work. There was a special issue that was produced in 1967. So, basically this special issue compiled the 30 years of social work in India. Then we have Professor T.K. Nair. He has worked on the 4 decades of social work practice and education in India. Then we have Professor K.K. Jacob's work on the 5 decades of social work education in India. So, basically these are some of the compilation of social work literature which we can refer. To continue further on the social work literature, Association of Schools of Social Work India has also compiled books and conference proceedings. The government also has been initiating a lot of activity regarding documenting social work literature. Some of the notable ones are Government's Encyclopedia of Social Work, which was produced in 2 volumes. The first volume was in 1968, the second volume was in 1987. The journals which are of good reference to students community can be Indian Journal of Social Work, Contemporary Social Work, Perspective of Social Work. Also, there has been efforts regionally to produce journals. Some of the regional efforts can be the ones which is produced in Lucknow, the ones which are produced in Mumbai, the one which is produced in Assam. So, some of the journals which we can refer are the regional efforts. Some of the key areas of indigenous social work literature I will be highlighting here. So, the first one is in terms of literature which is specific to Indian social cultural realities. If we are practicing social work in the Indian context, we have to be familiar with the socio cultural realities of the country. So, a lot of indigenous literature is also available. Even though there were early criticism that social work education was Western specific and is influenced by American literature. So, a lot of indigenous work has been produced by Indian scholars like Kulkarni, Mazumdar, Pathak and A. Desai, and they also argue that indigenous literature exists and are growing over the time, and a lot of indigenous social work literature is extensively based on the practice oriented aspect of the Indian social work. What we see right now is that a lot of indigenous effort to translate the Western literature in the indigenous language has been made. The literature has been translated, the Western literature has been translated to Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, but at the same time what we see is that most of the work from Hindi social work literature or social work literature which is based on Maharashtra or Gujarat is not been translated back to English. That is one of the major gaps that we see in terms of the Indian literature, because a lot of English literature has been translated, but the original Indian writing is not translated into English. Some of the gaps and the limitation that we see in the Indian literature is that most of the indigenous literature are based mostly on field based publications, but what we are lagging right now is that the indigenous theorization in terms of the Indian literature is lagging. So, a lot of focus has to be brought in this area. Secondly, what we see is that the practitioners play a very important domain in the social work field, but what we see is that social work practitioners really publish. So, this gap can be filled when practitioners who are practicing in the health setting, education, who are working as grassroots workers, they document those practices and brought it in as a literature. Also at the same time what we see is that when we look at the literature, institutions and educators, there is a limited coordinations amongst them. So, if we have to increase the quality, if we have to increase the volume of literature that is available in the social work paradigm, we have to see more educators and institutions collaborating with one another. Some of the key areas concerns which is pulling back the Indian literature can be mainly because what we see is that there is a bias towards English. So, even though we have a lot of good practices, good field based learnings, since most of the writings are in English, so that is why we do not see so much of indigenous social work literature. Also at the same time when we talk about literature, mostly literature pertains to formal academic writing. So, that is why we do not see many practitioners documenting the lessons learned, also the best practices. Also what we see is that when we look at the larger accessibility of literature that is available, there are a lot of grey literature, unpublished material that is lying in social work schools, libraries, institutions, universities. So, since everything is not digitalized, so those grey literature, unpublished material cannot be referred easily to the students. Also at the same time, as I already highlighted, that the field insights which is coming from the field are really undocumented in the case of the Indian literature. To conclude, the Indian social work literature has matured over the years, but if we want to bring it more vibrant like what we see in the Western context, we need to make more regional efforts, we have to involve more practitioners, and also there needs to be a coordination between schools of social works. Then there will be greater visibility and validation of indigenous knowledge. Thank you very much.